I'm going to share with you all today about Project Vesta, um, which is a solution that we kicked off we launched on Earth Day of 2019. And it started with myself and Eric Matzner and David Snyder. I'd been working in the carbon removal space, mostly on commercializing a direct air capture technology, but also spending a lot of time doing independent analysis of other carbon removal solutions. Came across enhanced weathering as a solution that seemed to be pretty stalled out in the lab. And when I met my co-founder, Eric, it became clear that we both had a deep passion for climate and a deep belief that coastal enhanced weathering had the chance to really make a huge change. Kind of bringing us into the context of this year, I think so many of us were deeply affected by climate change. I, for the first time, was personally a climate refugee and had to evacuate my home twice. Luckily, my home was spared, but I don't need to tell this group that climate change has inexorably stacked the deck in favor of bigger and more intense fires across the West over the last few decades and truly across the world. I think the changing heat patterns, changing rain and snow patterns, shifts in plant communities, all of that has really affected the likelihood that fires will burn. And so here in the American West, we've been impacted deeply by it. Over 9.5 million acres were burned this year in 2020, compared with 4.7 last year in 2019. Right, so that's all you missed is you missed this beautiful graphic of Olivine, but otherwise this terrifying graphic of fires in California. And so anchoring again into, these unusually high temperatures, the last 5 years have seen 4 of the hottest years on record. And, species die off at mass scale. We're looking at over 50 years, a third of the species on planet Earth might go extinct. And in a worst case scenario, that could rise to about 55%. And so all of this coming together, just knowing that the time to act is really now, right? So as many of you know, unless we can reduce emissions by this much, we're not going to be able to make meaningful impact on climate change. Just simply stopping emissions is not enough. So we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And given the current state of technologies and political will and investment in current solution sets, we just can't quite do that. So again, like anchoring into needing to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And so with Project Vesta, we were asking the question of like, how has this worked on planet Earth historically? And what we found is that the carbonate silicate cycle is the most effective process, one of the most effective processes of this. So it's something that we all learned about in probably our eighth grade geology class, where a volcano will erupt and carbon goes into the atmosphere, and then you have volcanic rock that's spread along the surface, and as rain falls, the carbonic acid slowly breaks down the rocks, and over long geologic timescales, that rain falling on volcanic rocks causes a chemical reaction that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That carbon travels through waterways and then ends up as limestone on the ocean floor. And this has worked for billions of years, slowly locking up trillions of tons of carbon dioxide into rock over geologic timescales. And so the question we asked is, how do we speed this up? Like I said, this is one of the most effective processes. So over 99.9% of all carbon on Earth is actually stored in rock. And this rock specifically, olivine, this is a more gemstone version of it. Olivine in its gemstone version is actually called peridot. But olivine is this volcanic green mineral, and we believe it can really help reverse climate change by accelerating this natural process. It's one of the most effective rocks at removing carbon from the atmosphere, and it's highly abundant. It makes up over 50% of the upper mantle. So research on this process has been done in labs for over 30 years. And these lab studies have shown that with olivine sand, it can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere when it's mechanically activated. It's been done in flume experiments and in shaker studies. And what we're looking to do is vastly accelerate that. So we've designed this pretty elegant process where we take rocks, olivine green sand rocks, and grind them into sand, and then transport them to coastal areas. Once we transport the rocks to these coastal areas, nature does the rest. So the natural free energy of waves grinds down the rocks and accelerates that carbon capture process and locks the carbon into rocks for millions of years. And so many of us are thinking about what carbon removal solution can really make a difference here. And I definitely believe that there's no one solution that's going to solve climate change, if you will. It's going to take a vast array of different solution sets, different entrepreneurs and investors to really scale this effort. And another reason why I love Witnesses is that we all get to get together and talk about how we can support one another and make that happen. But when we're looking for an effective solution, it's important that we're meeting 3 criteria. So we want it to be economical, cost effective enough that it can really scale through the sale of carbon credits or otherwise, that eventually there will be market support for a solution. We want to make sure that it's permanent, so that the money and time that we spend sequestering carbon doesn't just go right back up into the atmosphere. So for example, when an entire forest catches on fire after we've planted it or what have you, how do we design against that and work with the forces of nature? And we want it to be scalable. So we want to scale up to over 1 billion tons a year, right? And with Project Vesta, we anticipate after testing it to make sure that it works in the real world, coastal enhanced weathering, we anticipate we'll actually be able to achieve all 3 of these. So it's highly economical at scale. We anticipate that it'll come in at about $16 per ton, which is, over 100 times cheaper than some current solutions. You have direct air capture coming in at $600 to $800, depending on whose models you're looking at, with a goal of, I believe it's $100 per ton in 2050. And we're hoping that in the next, 5 to 10 years, this could scale to $16 a ton. It's permanent. As I mentioned, it fixes into rocks for millions of years. And it's scalable. So there's plenty of olivine, there's plenty of beaches. We don't need to compete for land or other economic activities. We don't need to build industrial plants. There's no new technology. The beautiful piece of this solution is that we're actually able to work with, the legacy infrastructure of an industry that ravaged this planet, the mining industry, and utilize that same infrastructure for doing good and removing carbon from the atmosphere. This process is also highly efficient. So the way that we've looked at deploying coastal enhanced weathering, it's about 95% efficient, meaning that for every ton of carbon dioxide that's emitted in the process of mining, milling, and transporting the olivine, we're able to remove 20 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And for a little context on that, every ton of olivine, when placed in an ocean ecosystem, is able to remove 1.25 tons of carbon dioxide. So just touching a little bit more into that price point, we believe that right now we're focused on demonstrating the science and proving that this solution is safe and effective in the real world. But once we have the science proven, we believe that the economics really favor this scaled deployment, that can be delivered for less than $20 a ton, much cheaper than other permanent approaches, and also above the currently forecasted carbon prices. So the numbers that we're looking at here are in the EU compliance market. Forecasted, to be about $55 in 2023, meaning that we'll come in below them. And so Project Vesta exists to prove the science. So to take the 30 years of research that have kind of stalled out and take that basic science, advance it so that the costs, benefits, and risks of coastal enhanced weathering are very clearly understood. So we're focused on real world testing and viability in order to enable this market-based ecosystem to take place once we have clarity that the science is favorable. And so the left and the right sides are somewhat simple in some ways. The middle, the real world testing, is where we're truly kind of the only party taking action today. And this process has been kind of stalled out and underinvested in, as I mentioned. So we're dedicated to proving the science as a research organization, so that coastal enhanced weathering can exist. And this year's been pretty great for us. We've earned a fair bit of national press coverage in The Atlantic, in Reuters, in Fast Company, and in the MIT Tech Review. And we've also done a lot of other things. So in 2020, we selected and began sampling at our first pilot experimental beach, which is going to be hosting the first ever in situ experiment of coastal enhanced weathering. We built out a life cycle assessment and a green paper, which outlined the scientific case for coastal enhanced weathering. We launched a podcast about carbon dioxide removal. It's called Going Negative. We went through the Foresight Institute's Accelerator program, and we're the first prize winner for that. We significantly expanded our network of scientific collaborators to over 20 experts in the field, and also grew our team and our full-time scientific team. We also raised over $1 million, with 250,000 of that being a really exciting partnership with Stripe, as Olya mentioned. Stripe surveyed, I believe it was about 25 companies to determine who to support, what nascent carbon removal technologies to support. And we were one of 4 that they chose. So we completed the first ever purchase of negative emissions from coastal enhanced weathering. And looking forward in 2021, our next step is to start these beach trials. So our experimental plan is completely set and ready, and we're ready to start these beach trials. We've built out a custom mobile lab to test the beach and be able to scale the experiments in different locations. And then through these experiments, we're going to be testing a number of different parameters, over 160 parameters, to understand the full suite of ecological effects, measure the carbon dioxide removal rate, and also create an integrated assessment model. So as I mentioned, we're a nonprofit project, and all the work that we're doing is open source, transparent, as a research project to enable scale here. So this integrated assessment model is really key to what we're creating. We're attempting to do 3 things in this model: prove the safety, measure the speed of removal, and then also provide a life cycle assessment. So this integrated assessment model should enable NGOs, nonprofits, and governments to be able to deploy this solution with somewhat predictable results once we have the science proven. And so we're raising 2.5 million to fund these pilot experiments and really scale our work in phase 1. It's exciting to hear about your new project, Olya, Diamond List, right? Because with so many nascent technologies, there's just not conventional funding sources for this type of research. The funding gap kind of lies within this research endeavor that's a bit too expensive for academia and too early for governments. So we rely primarily on donations. And as I mentioned, this partnership with Stripe was an amazing component of that, where they're really subsidizing the OpEx of what we're doing by pre-purchasing carbon removal credits. But as mentioned, we rely mostly on philanthropic donations. And ways that folks can get involved today is we're looking for support to get the word out. So sharing about Project Vesta on social media, telling your friends, introducing us to press contacts. We're also fundraising. As I mentioned, we actually have a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo going right now, a crowdfunding campaign that I'll drop the link to. And we're always looking to be connected with any individuals that might be interested in supporting us. And or sharing our website to make a donation. And we're also currently looking for grant writers and interns today within Project Vesta. And yeah, our overall mission is to just accelerate this natural weathering process to do our part in supporting reversing climate change.
Ooh. All right, everybody now unmute yourselves. I know it's surprising, but that's the one thing that I miss about like real world events. All right, unmute yourself. Now clap
Hello.
vigorously. Clap vigorously.
Hey.
Excellent. Okay, now mute yourself back, and for questions, either drop them in the chat or raise a hand. Kelly, amazing presentation. I think we've already got the first question in the chat. Joe, you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Sure. Thanks a lot for the overview, Kelly. So one of the things I was really curious about is the how challenging it is to measure carbon dioxide removal in the coastal context.
Yeah. So the 1 ton of carbon, 1 ton of olivine for every 1.25 tons of carbon dioxide removed, that metric is based on lab experiments. And so we have that as a metric to begin with. And then in these experiments that we're doing in open systems, it's not exactly hard, it is somewhat expensive. So that's the piece of the 2.5 million that we're raising right now, is because we're heavily instrumenting these first beaches and monitoring the carbon removal through a number of different methods, everything from carbon in the atmosphere to dissolved particulate in the ocean to even tissue toxicology in some of the marine organisms. So we're doing pretty rigorous tests to understand exactly the CDR rate. And
you get a local atmospheric reduction effect then?
We'll be testing for that.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, next up we've got Joy. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi. Sorry, I'm in my living room. I had to get my husband to mute the television. So we know that continental weathering is a large source of micronutrients to the open ocean, which has the added benefit potentially of stimulating surface ocean productivity and cyanobacterial drawdown of CO2. Do you have any idea if the work that you're proposing would have that stimulatory effect of seeding the ocean with micronutrients, or is that something down the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. So specifically, olivine is a magnesium silicate rock, and silicate feeds diatoms and other microorganisms, right? So when you're talking about micronutrients and the way that might nourish ocean ecosystems, there's huge potential there for balancing diaflagella and phytoplankton populations. That's definitely a piece that we're testing for, and we really hope that the benefit will be there and be made very evident. I think that some of the pushback we get is like, oh, but it's the ocean, and aren't you afraid of what's going to happen to the ecosystem? And certainly, we're very concerned with that. And that's why we're doing this rigorous testing. But analyzing all of the evidence that we have to date, we have really good reason to believe that the impacts on marine ecosystems will actually be beneficial. One piece is this diatom piece. And the other piece is just that in the local ocean ecosystem where we deploy olivine, you'll have lower acidity. And so that will spur a lot more potential for thriving for different marine organisms.
Awesome. Next up, we have Andrew with a raised hand.
Yeah, this is a question which looks kind of personal, but it belies a wider context. Should I sell my gas car and get a Tesla, or should I keep my gas car and then pay you guys to get rid of the carbon dioxide that I produce while driving my gas car? Because that is a real question. Like, I mean, I've got a Tesla that's on order that I might cancel if I can find a cheaper way of mitigating the emissions from my car, right? But it cuts, much deeper than that, because I'm making a point more generally about what the purpose of this kind of activity is. Should people be, using it to keep, economically efficient pollution going and offset their climate guilt, or should we only be using it for, the last mile, the absolute last little bit of emissions we can't get rid of any other way, right? Rice paddies and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's that typical like, isn't this a moral hazard question? If we incentivize and negative emissions, just removal, and aren't incentivizing cutting emissions, then we're going to end up in the same kind of issue later on. And I'll say that I think I think both and, right? Like you should probably get a Tesla and do your part in spurring the market that way, because we definitely need to electrify and decarbonize our economy. Yet at the same time, just decarbonizing our economy isn't going to do it anymore. The point that we're at now, we're kind of hitting a tipping point where we must remove carbon from the atmosphere, and so it's going to take a coordinated market effort of both emissions reductions and carbon removal. And I think that for every person, there's different choices that we're making for sure, be it what we work on or what kind of car we drive. But I definitely wouldn't, I don't think I would condone to get a heavy diesel burning car and and just pump all your money into carbon removal. I'd say that there's probably a middle path. But it's a great question. I think that's a question a lot of people ask when we get to a more macro scale of how corporations are involved with carbon removal credits and what that means for heavy polluters and how they can continue doing that work in the world.
Guys, I usually don't jump into the Q&A, but just this one time.
Okay.
Andrew, I think it's a fabulous question. I think the atmosphere doesn't care where that molecule of CO2 comes from. So if it turns out that the right solution is to keep our lifestyle and pay Project Vesta $16 a ton is cheaper than switching your car, I am a big believer in the thing that matters is the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere and the cheapest way of removing that. But I think for this particular thing, there's another thing you should consider, which is if you buy a Tesla or not, doesn't really matter to Tesla, no offense, but like you're one person. While as for things that are just getting started, you have a huge, huge outsized impact on contributing to new science, right? And I know that Kelly can't say this because she's modest and it's her project, but as somebody who deals with a lot of like early stage stuff, right? I think making sure that there are more shots on goal, right? That like really investment or donation or whatever to like really early stage things, I think has an outsized impact compared to putting the exact same money into Tesla. So I think like there is a multiplier there. And I think there's also a multiplier in starting your own project, and there's a multiplier in working on the project, on a climate project, which you're uniquely suited for, which is separate, I think, than things like switching cars, because the incentives, the government incentives are going to be there. And I think a lot of people are going to switch, even if it's less economical than the kind of direct choice.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah, sorry, had to do this. Silicon, is that similar to Joe's question, or do you still want to ask it? Phil?
Hi. I think Joe kind of had the same question. I think I was curious about sort of the mechanics of how it was measured, and it seems like Kelly's answer was like all of them. So which seems fair. So yeah, that's great.
Great.
Kelly, do you guys also have like a local anti-ocean acidification effect potentially? I think
that's what we'll be testing for. That's absolutely what we're anticipating.
Awesome. Julie Mitchell?
Yeah, hi. So I had a question more about the chemistry of what's going on. So, I understand kind of the big picture of what you're talking about in terms of having large deposits of olivine on beaches and how they would be mechanically broken down by wave action. But I'm curious, ideally, like for a particular olivine grain that you put on a beach, can you walk through really quickly what you want to have happen to that particular grain? Like, would it be broken down? Would its magnesium ions be, lost from the olivine, and then they bind with carbonate, and then you have a magnesium carbonate precipitating out of solution? Or can you talk a little bit about the more chemical details of what's going on?
Definitely. I'm going to actually share my screen because it's probably easier to follow that way. So we have the olivine, which is a magnesium silicate. It's and as we mentioned, when that interacts with H2O, water, we have the magnesium that's released, and that separates, right? The other resulting molecule or ion is this silicate ion that, as we mentioned, can be used by diatoms. And then we also have OH. So when carbon dioxide is consumed, then it turns into this bicarbonate that is then bioavailable to marine organisms. And that can help deacidify the local ocean ecosystem. And it also can be utilized by corals and different marine calcifying organisms that can use it in their skeletons and shells. And then as those organisms die, that bicarbonate will settle to the bottom of the seafloor as limestone, where it's kind of subducted back into the Earth's crust.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Next up, we've got Cass.
Oh, hey. Yeah, I have no idea that you guys started in 2019. It's so impressive, like how fast you move and how like established you've grown since then. I'm just kind of curious, like why you chose to structure as a nonprofit rather than a for-profit, because it seems like it might help your scaling if you had done for-profit. But I'm just genuinely curious because it's an interesting, unique structure.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this question, and I think everyone asks it because there is obviously a market for coastal enhanced weathering. As you mentioned, Olia, it's one of the cheapest solutions out there, and the cheapest permanent solution. However, being a nonprofit enables us to collaborate with the leading scientists in the field, and our motives truly at this point are science-based and planet first. And so we're focused on proving the science to make sure that this solution absolutely has no negative effect on any ocean ecosystems, and that it's only it's either neutral or beneficial to ocean ecosystems. And so until we understand the full suite of effects of what happens when you introduce olivine into an open system, we're not ready to scale. And so we're committed to proving the science so that that market-based ecosystem can take place later. And certainly there will probably be a very large marketplace for coastal enhanced weathering, carbon removal companies that pop up. But where we are today is at a place to just prove the science, and then we can get there.
And Kaz, actually, it's in general, it's like impossible to get paid before you prove the science for something as complex as that. Like to get it approved in the EU ETS or California Cap and Trade or the voluntary methodologies. Like there's lots of stuff that needs to be proven for something that's as complex and geological as that. So it's except for small pioneers like Stripe, you actually would have a lot of trouble with that. So
yeah,
makes sense. Next we've got Adam.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk, Kelly. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit more about the mining aspect of the process, and I'm curious how you think about how that affects scalability, how localized can that mining be to the beaches, and just talk a bit about that side of it.
Yeah. So olivine is found on every continent. It's widely abundant, and it's actually the tailings of a lot of mining operations. So it's the waste product that can be reused and then redistributed. And that is a piece of what we're looking at is how we can utilize tailings and waste products to cut down on costs, but also just not have to endeavor on new mining operations just yet. However, that being said, there are massive olivine quarries, and that is something that we will do as we get to scale. So when it comes to the process itself, we actually see this as a huge opportunity, as an opportunity to sort of rewrite what it is mining needs to be, and how we can employ more sustainable mining practices, because the mining process is definitely going to feed into our life cycle assessment, and needs to be deeply considered. My father actually was in the mining company, or was in the mining industry, like large scale mining of copper and metals, and it's always been curious to me of like what the opportunity set is there for small sustainable mining, or even like remediation at mining sites that otherwise wouldn't really be habitable by humans again. Olivine is also, it's so close to the surface in many places that we wouldn't need to do deep pit mining. So there's a lot more of a sustainable tilt that way. And then the other piece that I'd say when we're talking about getting to scale, I mentioned a little bit during my talk that there's this opportunity to work with legacy infrastructure. So that's everything from how do we understand how ships are moving across the ocean and work with empty containers to get olivine to the beaches that's necessary and not have wasted carbon moving across the ocean. To really trying to make sure that the olivine that we deploy at larger coastline sites is close to the mines where we're sourcing it from.
Awesome. Next up, we've got Sean.
Hello, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And thanks for addressing the thing about like pH effects in the local water. So, but like going out from that more generally, what are the constraints on like how rigorously you can use your like designated length of coastline? Like what are the constraints of what kinds of coastline can be used for this purpose? And then like to the extent that you know how rapidly you can dump stuff in it, is it mostly just like dictated by like mechanical sweeping it away, or like what other ecological constraints are you looking at, assuming you have like a relatively heavy metal free olivine source?
Yeah. So typically when we're looking at our first pilot experiments, we're looking for mostly tropical warm water with a high refresh rate. So pretty like high wave action. However, as we scale, this can kind of go, we anticipate this can kind of go anywhere. So the constraints on the coastline that can be used will be mostly from the governments that we work with or the local areas that we work with. So what we can get a permit for and what we can't. That being said, we've pivoted a little bit. We started talking about this as green sand beaches. And the reality is that we don't actually have to make beaches. So coastlines are best. Putting it on the coastline is best in some ways, but it doesn't need to be above the coastline. It can be actually under the shoreline. And it also doesn't have to be on coastline. So when we look at a place like the English Channel, for example, where we have a rapid refresh rate and a lot of wave motion, it could also go somewhere like there. The process might be slightly slowed by the colder water, but because, what the water really helps with is as the grains are colliding, we're breaking down the silicate coating, which expedites that process in a huge way. And so warmer water is better for that, but not absolutely necessary. And that's another piece of what we're going to be testing. More in phase 2 is a larger dynamic set of different ecosystems and how that affects the weathering rate. But I wouldn't say the sky's the limit, but it can go on just about any coastline. Something I didn't mention is that a piece of why we're so compelled by this solution is that we've calculated we'd only need to cover 2% of global shelf seas in order to sequester humanity's annual emissions through this process. So a very small portion of land for a huge impact.
Thank you.
Bruce, you're up next.
Yeah, that just answered my question. I said, how many miles of beach are you need to do this? He said 2% of the coastal shelf, so that gives a pretty good indication. That seems like a small number, but do you ever anticipate putting like this on public beaches and people come see my green olivine beach that's doing its thing to sequester carbon, and isn't it a great thing? And I don't mind walking on green sand, or is it compatible with public beaches, that kind of stuff?
It is compatible with public beaches. So there's a natural green sand beach in Hawaii called Papakolea that a lot of folks have been to. In some of our earlier branding, it was the main image that we used. And so on Papakolea, a thriving marine ecosystem there, and people visit the beach all the time. I think that marine sort of like ecotourism is definitely one side of the market. Another that we've looked to as there's carbon credits, and then there's like ecotourism, but then there's also beach nourishment, which is $1 billion industry where beaches are being nourished by outside sand all over the world, whether it's because of sea level rise or because people want new sand. So there's a lot of ways that we can collaborate on beach nourishment efforts as well.
Awesome. We've got a question from Maria. That's a non-mute one. You mentioned the basic research on the olivine process had stalled or slowed down. Any ideas as to why, and what can we do to make sure that this type of research in general, not just for Olivine, but for other solutions, doesn't fade into obscurity?
Yeah, I think that for some parts of it, it was a lack of funding. The industry had been pretty underinvested in. Folks have looked into like spreading olivine sand or olivine rocks on arable land quite a bit. You might have seen there was a few articles that went somewhat viral this year about, can't we just put olivine on our agricultural fields? And yes, you can. It's just a lot slower. I think that because there wasn't a clear marketplace for it, it wasn't getting a lot of investment, and the scientists that had been working on it just kind of slowed. What we did is we picked up that science and then came into partnership with some of the leading writers on it to try and bring it into the real world.
Awesome.
And in terms of making sure that this kind of research doesn't fade into obscurity, I think we all need to keep a really open mind and a curious finger on the pulse of what we're not paying attention to. And really, as all of us being like solutionaries in our own right, apply ourselves to the areas that we think are potentially incredibly impactful.
Thanks. Next question from Michal.
Hi. Fascinating technology. Thank you for telling us about it and answering the myriad of questions. I have two questions. The first one is around sea level rise and just the sort of changing state of coastline and beaches in terms of beaches losing sand and needing replenishment. And so it's sort of like how long does the sand need to stay on the beach in order to capture all the CO2, and what are there certain places that are going to be better suited for it than others? And then my second question is around the kind of non-renewable nature of this. So I think particularly for situations where there's like mine tailings or discarded rock that contains olivine, I think this is a good use for it. But when it comes to like mining new olivine, it just sort of the environmentalist in me finds that sort of problematic. The idea of like going out, taking this beautiful rock, olivine is pretty gorgeous and has other potential uses, and then crushing it for the single purpose of sequestering carbon, which to me is sort of like a cleaning up the garbage that we put out into our atmosphere use. What are other things that can be done at the same time, or what's the potential for getting olivine from mine tailings versus going out and harvesting new olivine? So two separate questions.
Cool. So sorry, you'll have to excuse me. I think my computer's having some sound issues, so I had to like put my.
No, I think Michal was a little far from the microphone.
Okay, so the first question around was mostly about refresh rate, which is going to be different at different beach sites, right? So at some sites we might choose to replenish olivine and put olivine back on as it's washed away, but it's actually not that important. The sea level rise component isn't that important to the process because it can be above or below the coastline, and the process will still work in just the same way. So when it comes to beach nourishment, for example, a lot of beach nourishment is not done by putting sand actually on the beach, but by using tidal forces and putting it maybe a mile away or a short bit away where the waves bring it in. And so we could do a similar thing with olivine where it wouldn't need to be put directly on the coastline and the process would still work. And then responding to the question about mining olivine and the potential hazards or implications there, especially from an environmental standpoint, I definitely appreciate that perspective, and I've questioned that for myself as well. And ultimately, where I stand with that is that the risks of not doing this are far too large. are far larger than the risks of mining a little bit of olivine. When we're talking about global stands of how much olivine exists, right? It's over 50% of the upper mantle. It's a vastly abundant mineral, and we would need to mine about as much copper as is mined in China in 1 year, is how much we would need to mine of olivine. So for the potential environmental impacts of that, I think the benefits far outweigh the costs if this solution works. So that's the way I look at it.
Thank you. Next, Jonathan Morgenstein.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. And sorry, I came in late, so I didn't hear kind of like most of your presentation, but I've been listening in a bunch. And my only real question is, I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I'm not actually a scientist. I work on business and financial modeling, but I was wondering, one, are you working with NREL? And two, if not, just want to say, like, if there's some way that I can help put you in touch with people at NREL who could work with you on this, then please let me know.
Great. Yeah, we're not in touch with them, so would love to connect with you afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm happy to make the connection.
Thank you.
All right, next we got Eric.
Yeah, hey, thanks. So I'm curious, as you're doing these beach studies and trying to figure out exactly what the life cycle is, I'm expecting that in large scale, you're going to have a fair amount of your olivine migrate with the currents off the beaches and elsewhere. And some of that is going to end up buried in silts, and therefore it's going to be less active. You're not going to be weathering the surface layers off. How are you going to measure that? And how are you going to account for that as you're doing your life cycle analysis?
So how are we going to measure the carbon removed, or how are we going to measure which piece exactly?
Well, if you can't measure how much of your sand ends up inactive, like doesn't actually contribute to carbon removal, how are you going to measure? You can't measure your actual carbon removal either. So as the sand flows away from the beaches and maybe gets used up and maybe doesn't, maybe gets buried, you're sequestering olivine instead of sequestering carbon. And how are you going to measure that in your experiments to make sure that you can trust your numbers for how much carbon you're sequestering per ton of olivine?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, so we'll be measuring the carbon sequestered, over first like a 1 year cycle and then a 3 year cycle in different local ocean ecosystems through a number of different variables, whether that's different mineral release contents, and then, as I mentioned, carbon in the atmosphere, and we'll be getting a general rate from that combined experiment, those combined instruments, right? And then kind of extrapolating that out over that. Of course, I haven't designed the experiment myself. I'm not a scientist in that way, so I can't answer with the most specificity. But we do have a paper that I'd be happy to send that's a little bit more in depth about exactly how we're quantifying and some more of our experimental design.
Thanks, that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to send that out to everybody or
great
directly. And next up, we've got Rafi. Maybe we've got Rafi. All right, we'll come back to Rafi later. We've got a couple of responses to the previous question, Andrew's question about Tesla. So there's a couple of good things there from Jonathan Tumim. And the next question is from Stephanie.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Yeah, I just had a question. Oh, sorry, my dog. Have you gotten any interest from like governments specifically on the ocean mitigation, like the ecosystem mitigation stuff, like Great Barrier Reef, things like that?
Yeah, we're beginning to have some of those conversations. Once again, I think most governments want to see that we've proven the science first before we engage in any real partnership, which is totally understandable. However, as we move forward, I think the governments that we're looking to partner with first are those who are making more considerable considerable efforts on their Paris commitments. Those are kind of the folks that we're targeting first, and then of course those that are in some sensitive marine areas. And I think that there's definitely a lot of room for collaboration with them.
Are you, sorry, just a quick follow-up. Like, I'm sure you have a lot of connections and contacts, but do you need any or desire any like connections to nonprofits doing stuff like in that space, or like the ocean?
Sure. Yeah, that would be fantastic, especially as we're looking at our next pilot or our next experimental beach sites, and looking for those next experimental beach sites. I think it would be really exciting to partner with other nonprofits that are doing similar work. Something that I would love to see is like a green sand beach where we also have, I'm not sure if you all are familiar with Green Wave, for example, and they do like 3D mariculture. So where we have like a green sand beach, and then there's also a 3D mariculture deployment happening where they're growing oysters and mussels and kelp, and there's just like this gorgeous ecosystem of carbon drawdown. So yeah, if you have anyone specific in mind, we'd love to connect and collaborate.
There's a there is one Australian nonprofit that's doing some great work. That anyway, yeah, I'll follow up with Oya.
Awesome, thank you.
Sweet. Chris, I promise Kelly we'll end this at 1 o'clock and then breakout groups, but at least the question portion. Chris, you got a question?
Yes, I think it already got answered.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, let's try going back to Rafi, who I think we skipped over. All right. In that case, back to Julie.
Hey, so one of the earlier questions about mining olivine and that it's a finite resource got me thinking that, there are other minerals that are a lot more prevalent and maybe a lot more accessible than olivine. And so I was wondering if you've thought about some of those other options, even just using basalt, since it also has a lot of magnesium. And obviously the ocean crust is, mostly basalt. So have you thought about mixing things up a little bit compositionally, or, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's certainly an option. So basalt works as well, any ultramafic rock. We've looked at other rocks that could perform this process. Olivine is, again, the most efficient one that we've been looking at, but we've definitely had conversations with people where they're like, well, what if it was a black sand beach instead of a green sand beach? Wouldn't that just be better? And so there's definitely a way where we could combine different rocks and use basalt. At this point in time, our experiments are all mostly olivine, but it's something that we're looking into.
Oh, thanks.
And Andrew? Unless you still have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was just reading the reply, so I was lost in the other screen. I wanted to understand when the product will be available to buy, how much would it cost, and what are your practical limits to scaling? I mean, can you just buy an infinite amount of olivine and chuck it off a ship, or are there going to be real limits to how quickly you can scale this? Because $20 a ton is real cheap. That's down in you're competing with the bullshit offsets. You're not competing with the actual carbon dioxide removal, right? So even people that are quite happy to buy bullshit offsets will probably start buying your product because it's actually not bullshit.
So you're saying how much is the product? You've got it pretty much right. I think once we've got to scale, it'll be between $16 to $25 a ton on the carbon marketplace. A piece of why we're creating this integrated.
So ton carbon, not ton olivine, right?
What's that?
That's ton carbon, not ton olivine.
Yeah, a ton of carbon dioxide. Yeah. So why we're creating this integrated assessment model is to try and create a standard for best practices for how to deploy this process. So in order to be able to feel confident of just chucking olivine off the side of a boat onto a coastline, for example. You'd really want to understand the suite of effects that might happen in that local ecosystem. And so that's a key piece of what we're doing. And like I said, I think that there will be an ecosystem of companies and NGOs that are working on this once the science is proven, that will probably kind of arise. And we'll definitely encourage that to happen.
But when are you going to start selling this? And then you say that's your long-term price, but what's your short-term price?
It's
Are you
hard
going
to
to do
say.
what Carbon Engineering have done and sell it for like 10 times more than their long-term price that they're advertising?
So it's hard to say when exactly we'll begin selling it. We anticipate, 1 to 3 years before the science is fully proven. We did do this pre-purchase agreement with Stripe, which was really exciting. And there's a couple other companies that are interested in making the sorts of commitments that Stripe has. So what Stripe has done is they're paying a premium for the carbon offset, or the carbon removal credit rather, because they're interested in supporting funding the OpEx of nascent technologies. So for specific partners that there's a reason to partner with and sell the credits today, that's an option. But we also have, we have like a longer time horizon of fulfilling on that carbon removed with a partnership like Stripe, for example. So that's the reason why we did that, but we're not selling carbon credits just yet until we have more science.
So what's the minimum order if someone comes to you today? What's the minimum? Because you did a deal with Stripe, so how big would someone have to be before you talk to them? I mean, like you've got the deal between Oxy and Carbon Engineering as a comparison. That's a pretty big deal, right? So what kind of scale of sales are you looking at?
So for us, it would be, it's not as much scale as it is flexibility and time horizon, right? So with Stripe, it's a couple of years before we have to provide the removals. And so we're really only looking to partner with folks who are really understanding of the fact that we're in the science kind of research phase right now. And so it would be a couple year horizon before we fulfilled.
You can donate any amount to their Kickstarter.
You can donate any amount to our Indiegogo and to our
Can you put it on the chat link so that I can amp it, please?
Yeah.
Sweet. Next question from Bruce.
It's a question again about the process. So olivine is sitting there and it's getting the water's coming down from the rain, getting rained on. Does that coat the olivine and make it less effective over time? Does it dissolve it? So what happens if it's just sitting there and again the rain keeps raining and it's not moving? Does it become less effective with time, or is it just sitting there?
If it's raining on it and the olivine's not moving.
Yeah, and there's nothing, and it's just sitting there. Does it get coated, and it become less effective, or it just get dissolved away and open up more?
The olivine will still weather slowly if there's no wave action. What we're doing is we're harnessing the wave action to expedite that process. So irregardless of where it is, if the olivine is exposed, if a volcanic rock like olivine is exposed to the surface and there's rain falling on it, and it converts to carbonic acid, and then this process is going to happen. But we're looking at a time scale of, geologic time scale if there's not an acceleration process. So that grain on grain collision from the waves that also breaks down that silicate coating is supporting the acceleration. So it'll still happen, just more slowly.
So is the silicate coating causing from the weathering, or is that just part of the way olivine is built?
That's just part of the olivine, yeah.
Well, see, what this is sort of dissolving it. So if you set it out there long enough, it just dissolves away, or is acid away.
Yeah, exactly. Very slowly.
So you're just trying to break that up into smaller pieces and keep it going as fast as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, one last question. Andres?
Hello. Sorry, my question was just about what you mentioned about aquaculture sequestering carbon. Is that actually a thing? And what is it called? I see blue carbon or green wave. What was that?
Yeah, blue carbon is a huge field that is thankfully getting a lot more attention right now. And yeah, Green Wave is one organization. There's a number of other ones and folks that are working on specifically kelp And there's also artificial upwelling, and there's like kind of a whole industry of blue carbon that you could look into. I'll see if there's some sources I can send after the talk.
That might have to be a whole other talk, or
Yeah.
probably several. Actually, I'll ask one more because it's from Aviv. Is there a probabilistic carbon market offset? So hedging on, it's got like a 30% chance of working, and therefore, we'll pay you whatever price times the 30%.
In terms of what we're selling them at today, or?
No, he was just asking if there's in general probabilistic carbon markets to differentiate between, like, to incorporate Andrew's chance of bullshit on the offset. So you can sort of start before the science is done. You can be like, well, it's like 30% likely. And so he was just asking if a market like that exists.
No, not that we've calculated.
All right, well, excellent. In that case, everybody unmute yourselves again.
And I just saw one more question about whether we're a 501c3, and we are. Yeah, we're a 501c3 with faraway projects. We're a DBA of that nonprofit organization.
Excellent. All right, now everybody unmute yourselves. Clap vigorously, not just for the talk, but for something so amazing of answering, I believe, nearly 40 minutes of this.